Thanks so much for joining us today, Senator Crabtree. First of all, what have you been up to during the legislature's recess?
Well, it's calving season, and we ranch here in Grangeville, so we've been following cows and calves around and braving the blizzards, and we've had some pretty tough weather for a while, and the wind has been pretty severe. But the last 2 days just wonderful. So yeah, at times it seemed like being in the legislature wasn't a bad idea. Today, not so much.
It seems like that COVID-inspired recess came at a pretty convenient time for the ranchers.
So,
I'm curious that you sit on so many pivotal committees that address such important topics that are really coming up a lot this session. I'm thinking, of course, the Joint Budget Committee, Transportation, and Education. First of all, when it comes to the needs that you're hearing from your constituents in Idaho County, in your district, does what they're saying line up with what the legislature is trying to address in Boise? In other words, are those conversations in sync?
well, that's a hard question. Sometimes they are. Largely, we get to Boise and we hear things we haven't heard, and yet we have to deal with them. And maybe they've been heard from other parts of the state. Maybe there are certain legislators that like to have their voice heard louder than others. So we end up dealing with things that may not be so important to our local people. One of the things that I hear so much about regarding schools is the property tax burden that is put on them through the levy system. And, we've got some ideas on how to help that a little bit, but that's a big deal locally and not so much of a deal when you get to Boise. So, but we have some ideas we'll talk about in a few minutes, maybe that address that some.
Absolutely. And, you're vice chair of the Education Committee in the Senate. And there are big challenges facing Idaho students and educators right now, both when it comes to funding and when it comes to things like reading performance among our young students.
Right.
What, in your mind, does the legislature absolutely have to address this session in education before adjourning sine die?
Well, for me, if we want to make a difference in these lives of these students, we've got to deal with the fact that we're struggling at reading at third grade. We're half of the kids have an acceptable reading level at third grade. That is a great indicator of their future lives, is how well they can read in third grade. We're not doing well, and we've tried a few things, but I think what we're going to have to do is try to help these kids a little earlier. What we would love to have is to have these children helped by their parents, and the parents is in the family unit is the ideal scenario for this. The fact is that's not happening. The facts are we'd love to have it, but the truth is it's not happening in these homes as much as we'd like it to. One of my schools that I've talked to in my district says that 80% of the kids headed to the first grade are not prepared. Now, that indicates that they're not getting what we would like them to have from the family. And it's the family's trying. We have a high level of poverty, when people are working, they don't, and a lot of times they don't know what to do. So we're going to have to figure a way, if we want these children from rural Idaho, and that's what I represent most, to succeed and compete with the rest of the world, we're going to have to do better at preparing them for the rest of their education. To me, that starts with some sort of optional kindergarten effort for these kids. And many of the schools already have done some part-time thing, funded by the property tax owner. The property tax levies are funding the kindergarten because the state does nothing. So if we've got to solve this problem early, and our problem is that the children are coming and not prepared, the parents can't do it for whatever reasons, then we need to provide a way to help them. And we don't want a requirement, we want it optional. But that's an idea that I think will be necessary for this legislature to achieve a success in anything in education, in my view.
When we're talking about education, of course, this session, one of the hot topics was that early childhood education grant that was voted down in the House by one vote. Um, the Budget Committee has readdressed that. The legislature as a whole will take it up when you come back from recess. But do you think that JFAC has done enough to address the concerns of the House?
Well, time will tell on that, but we believe we have, or we wouldn't have sent it back to them. But it addresses the same issue I talked about earlier, is that we would love to have the families preparing these kids. And this idea of that grant is to help some of the families do this in an optional way. But we've got to find the solution. It's always easy to criticize somebody else's idea, but what is the solution to help these children be prepared to come to school? And while that's not a big grant, and it did come through the Trump administration and it was funded by private money, it still needs the funding authority to go through the legislature. And we'll find out if that kind of thing can be helpful. We believe it can, but this will be a way to find out. It's a $6 million project.
Some of the voices, as we're having this conversation, some of the voices in the House that were most concerned about this grant are House members from your district. I'm thinking Representative Shepherd and Representative Kings. I'm curious, have you had conversations with them to try and address some of their concerns?
I've talked to Representative Shepherd about it, and he understands some of these things, and I think he's beginning to get a picture of what we've got to find a solution. It's easy the critic is the easiest job in town. What are we going to do in terms of finding solutions to these problems? So, yeah, I think we're going to have success with that bill when it gets to the House this time, and yeah, it's been a lot of to do about a $6 million issue. There, I can talk about some $6 million things that were flowed through in a hurry, and maybe not been nearly as important as this one is. But that's the legislation. That's the process we are part of.
And that, of course, isn't the only budget that has hit road bumps on the way to the governor's desk. I'm thinking, too, of the Attorney General's budget. We know that the higher education budget is going to face a lot of scrutiny when it hits the House floor. How much more work are you anticipating the Joint Budget Committee having today?
Well, I expect we'll do as much work as we have to. We don't want to try to recook the things. We believe we've done a good job. And with regard to that higher ed budget, there's been a lot of stories told about it, and some people kind of filed their teeth early on this before we even had a budget, that this, we were going to solve the social justice problems, and that was what was wrong with the higher ed. We put together a budget that addresses this problem in 3 ways, and I don't know if we can visit about that now, Melissa, if you'd like. But what that has to do with is a 3-pronged approach to this social justice thing. Now, I don't hear so much about social justice out in the country as I do at the legislature, but I hear some. There is a concern that there's a social agenda being taught at higher education institutions in this state, and it's unacceptable to a lot of people, and particularly in the legislature. So because I worked at higher ed budget, and I am on the finance committee and in education, try to find a way to weave a solution, thread the needle if you'd like. That's kind of the common term now, but try to find a way where we can solve this higher ed debacle over this social justice issue. So I did 3 things. 1, penalize Boise State, which has been kind of the point of the spear on all the social justice conversations, and take money away from what they say are their social justice programs. The number I used was their number, and it's about $500,000. And then we also ask all universities by next January to report to us, the legislature, what they've spent on social justice programming. What kinds of things have they been doing? My guess is that number is going to be quite small. If we took it away from Boise State this year, and then others report they have it in January, what do you suppose is going to happen with that? So that's the second prong of the solution that we are proposing. And then the third prong is to ask the State Board of Education to take the student fees that are paid and make some of those into a pick list form so that all 4 universities have the same pick list to choose from. So if a student does not want to sign up for a certain club and pay the dues through their student fees, they don't have to. And at the University of Idaho, for example, that's $2,000. Now, maybe the students will choose half of that. I don't know. But it gives an option, and the students can then choose to whether they want to be part of social justice efforts. So it's a 3-pronged effort to try to deal with this. And we still want to get the message sent, but we don't want to damage what's going on in terms of other educational efforts at these universities.
I've heard so much about social justice concerns about what's being taught to students who, at the end of the day, are adults choosing to attend these institutes themselves. Um, is there a role at all for discussing this country's historical problems with racism? And where do you draw the line between this is a very appropriate and important conversation about racism that we need to have as a society, and this goes too far? And who gets to decide that?
Well, those are really good questions, Melissa, and I don't have the answers to them, but the legislature has the checkbook. So you kind of have to listen to the guy that's doling out the cash, whether you want to or not, or whether you like the message that they're telling. There has to be a coming together on how this works. I frankly uh, get a little concerned when legislatures get into curriculum development. I'm not sure we're well prepared for that. But on the other hand, we have concerns there, and the legislature as a body, maybe it's even more conservative than the state is, but it has the money in its hand. And so there has to be a finding of common ground here on this issue between the questions you ask and the legislature.
When it comes to issues that you brought up with public education, the K through 12 and the funding issues and the burden on property taxpayers, are you confident that the legislature is going to be able to address that before adjourning sine die?
No, I don't, but they're going to make some efforts with regard to, we're doing some things with this kindergarten legislation that I'm proposing, is to go ahead and not allow the levies to be assessed for kindergarten. So it's a shift of those charges to the state, which were changed in 2006 or so when now Senator Jim Risch was involved, and we shifted things locally. Now that hasn't turned out well for local schools in my area. Rural Idaho has not done well under the levy system. So maybe we need to relieve those property taxpayers of this part of their bill and shift it to the state where it was before. So that's what part of this kindergarten deal is to try to shift some taxes and try to give some relief to the people that I hear from about property taxes, while at the same time solving this big issue of our kids not being able to read by third grade as enough and not being prepared for first grade when they come. So we're going to be able to get two things done at once. I think it's a wonderful approach to do it. It's the best thing. Of course, I'm going to go back to it the third time. The parents, we want them to do it, and they still have the opportunity to do it. This is not a requirement, but if they can't, we want to be available to help those kids' futures be brighter.
One last question from your point of view on both the education and budget committees, as well as transportation, quite frankly, where would you like to see some of the American Rescue Plan Act money go in the future?
Well, I have several ideas for that, like other legislators, but one is one of the big issues in rural Idaho is broadband. And we put a bill through that I helped with through the legislature this year to establish a broadband group to make some plans and to distribute some monies and also provide an empty bucket to put money in for these things. So I think rural Idaho, if it's going to be really successful at educating kids, they are going to have better internet access. We have it at the schools, but when the kids drive out of town, they don't. Well, that's going to be a big deal. And so I think broadband is something that I think will help all of Idaho, but particularly rural Idaho, because you have small population density, but you still have the same needs per child. They still need to be able to access the internet. And we want them to have that opportunity. It helps us in a lot of other ways. It helps us in business. It helps us in safety and medical things too. But when we're talking education, I think it's a big deal.
All right. Senator Carl Crabtree, thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to do it. Thank you.